You are currently spending about a third of your life lying on a surface that a company convinced you to buy. The average American mattress costs over $1,000. Some cost $10,000. There are cooling mattresses, memory foam mattresses, mattresses with built-in speakers, and mattresses that track your sleep stages and send data to your phone. The global mattress industry pulls in somewhere around $45 billion a year, and that number keeps climbing. And yet, despite all of this technology, all of this engineering, all of this money, roughly 70 million Americans report chronic sleep problems. Insomnia prescriptions have doubled in the last 20 years across most industrialized countries. We have never had more tools designed to help us sleep, and we have never been worse at sleeping. But for roughly 300,000 years, anatomically modern humans slept on the ground, on dirt, on leaves, on animal hides thrown over packed earth. They had no memory foam, no box springs, no weighted blankets. And from everything we can tell, they slept just fine. So what did they know that we forgot? How does a species survive for hundreds of thousands of years sleeping on the ground, exposed to predators, insects, and freezing temperatures, and still wake up functional enough to hunt, forage, migrate, and eventually build the civilizations we inherited? The answer starts in a cave in South Africa. In 2011, a team of archaeologists working inside Sibudu Cave, a rock shelter carved into a sandstone cliff about 40 kilometers north of Durban, uncovered something that changed our understanding of how early humans lived. Buried beneath layers of ash and sediment, they found compressed plant material, specifically bundles of river sedge and swamp grass that had been deliberately gathered, carried into the cave, and arranged into what the researchers described as bedding. The beds were roughly 3 feet wide, they were layered, and they were old. The oldest layers dated to approximately 77,000 years ago, making them the earliest known evidence of a constructed sleeping surface anywhere in the world. But the real surprise was not the age, it was the sophistication. Mixed into those layers of sedge, the team found leaves from a plant called Cryptocarya woodii, a type of wild quince. That specific plant contains chemical compounds that repel mosquitoes and other biting insects. These were not random piles of grass. These were engineered sleeping surfaces with built-in pest control, crafted by people who understood their environment on a level that most of us never think about, and they maintained them. The evidence showed that the bedding was periodically burned and replaced, likely to kill parasites and lice that had accumulated over time. Think about that for a second. 77,000 years ago, someone living in a cave was practicing hygiene maintenance on their sleeping surface. They were not just surviving, they were problem-solving. The excavation team also found that the bedding layers grew more complex over time. The oldest beds from 77,000 years ago were simple grass layers, but by around 38,000 years ago, the beds in the same cave were thicker, more structured, and showed signs of being arranged for specific body positions. The people living in Sibudu were not just repeating what their grandparents had done. They were iterating. They were improving the design across generations. That is engineering, even if nobody was writing it down. And Sibudu was far from the only site. In Border Cave, also in South Africa, researchers found grass bedding dating to around 200,000 years ago, though the evidence is more fragmentary and debated. In Spain, at the Sibudu Cave site in Cantabria, Neanderthals left behind traces of organized sleeping areas with grass and other plant material roughly 53,000 years ago. That is worth pausing on. It was not just our species doing this. Neanderthals, a completely separate human lineage, independently developed the same solution. When two different species arrive at the same answer to the same problem, the answer is probably a good one. Now, Sibudu Cave is the most thoroughly documented example, but it was far from the only approach. Across Africa, Asia, and eventually Europe, early humans developed wildly different strategies for the same basic problem. You need to lie down, you need to rest your body, you need to do it safely, and you need to wake up without being eaten. In warmer climates, ground sleeping was common and practical. The earth itself retained heat from the day, And in tropical regions, the temperature differential between day and night was small enough that the ground stayed warm well past sunset. Early humans in sub-Saharan Africa likely slept directly on packed earth or sand, sometimes with thin layers of vegetation for cushioning. Their bodies were adapted for this. Our ancestors had different musculoskeletal structures than modern humans who spend their days sitting in office chairs. Their hip joints were more mobile. Their spinal curvature responded differently to firm surfaces. Skeletal remains from early anatomically modern humans show wear patterns on the hip and shoulder joints, consistent with regular side sleeping on firm surfaces, which is exactly the position that distributes body weight most evenly when there is no cushioning beneath you. Modern orthopedic research has actually confirmed that side sleeping is the most structurally neutral position for the human spine, which means our ancestors stumbled onto the optimal alignment thousands of years before anyone invented the word ergonomic. Lying on hard ground was not the torture it would be for someone who has spent 40 years sleeping on a pillow-top mattress. It was normal. Their bodies expected it. And critically, they moved during the day in ways that prepared their bodies for that kind of rest. They squatted, climbed, walked for miles across uneven terrain, and carried heavy loads. Their muscles and connective tissues were conditioned for ground contact. The modern back pain epidemic has less to do with our mattresses and more to do with the fact that we sit in chairs for 8 hours and then expect our spines to magically cooperate with any surface we lie down on. In cooler regions, the strategy changed. Animal hides became critical. After a successful hunt, the skin was one of the most valuable parts of the animal, not for decoration, but for warmth and bedding. Hides were scraped, sometimes treated with animal fat or brains to soften them, and used as both ground cover and blanket. Archaeological sites across Europe from the Upper Paleolithic period, roughly 50,000 to 10,000 years ago, show concentrations of animal bones and hide-scraping tools clustered near hearth areas. The sleeping zone and the fire zone were almost always next to each other, and that connection between fire and sleep was arguably the single most important development in the entire history of human rest. Fire changed everything. The control of fire, which most researchers now believe began with Homo erectus somewhere around 1 million years ago, did more for human sleep than any invention until the electric light bulb. And in a strange twist, it did almost the opposite of what the light bulb would eventually do. Before fire, sleeping was terrifying. Early hominids were not apex predators. They were mid-level creatures, sharing landscapes with leopards, hyenas, saber-toothed cats, and massive constricting snakes. Sleeping on the ground at night meant vulnerability. The fossil record is full of early hominin remains found inside predator dens, skulls punctured by leopard canines, bones cracked for marrow by hyenas. Sleep was a risk calculation. Every night meant gambling that nothing large and hungry would find you before sunrise. Fire changed that calculation overnight. A burning campfire created a circle of light and heat that most predators avoided. The crackling sound, the smoke, the flickering glow across the walls of a rock shelter, all of it signaled danger to animals that had learned to associate fire with wildfire and destruction. It did not eliminate the threat entirely, but it reduced it dramatically. Suddenly, sleeping on the ground near a fire was safer than sleeping in a tree, which is what many primates still do. And that safety allowed something remarkable to happen. Humans started sleeping longer. They started sleeping deeper. And the consequences were enormous. Deeper sleep meant more time in the REM stage, the phase of sleep associated with memory consolidation, emotional processing, and creative problem solving. Some anthropologists have argued that the control of fire did not just make humans safer, it made humans smarter. Better sleep led to better brains. Better brains led to more complex tools, language, social structures, and eventually art and ritual. The cave paintings at Lascaux, the carved bone tools of the Aurignacian period, the first musical instruments made from hollowed bird bones, none of that happens without deep, sustained, restorative sleep. And none of that deep sleep happens without fire keeping the leopards away. Fire did something else too. It reorganized space. humans started sleeping together. Community sleeping became the norm for most of human prehistory, and it stayed the norm far longer than most people realize. Families, extended kin groups, and eventually small bands of 15 to 30 individuals slept in clusters around shared fires. This was not sentimental, it was strategic. More bodies meant more warmth. More eyes and ears meant someone was always partially alert. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups show that in any given sleeping camp, at least one person is awake or semi-awake at virtually all times throughout the night. Not because of insomnia, but because of natural variation in sleep timing across a group. Older individuals tend to wake earlier, younger adults tend to stay up later. The overlap creates a kind of passive sentinel system, where the group is never fully unconscious simultaneously. A study published in 2017 in the Proceedings of the Royal Society examined this pattern among the Hadza people of northern Tanzania, one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer groups on Earth. Researchers tracked the sleep of 33 Hadza adults over 20 nights using wrist-mounted sensors. Out of more than 200 hours of nighttime observation, there were only 18 minutes total when every single person in the camp was asleep at the same time. 18 minutes. That is an astonishingly small window of collective vulnerability, and it happened naturally, without anyone assigning guard shifts or setting alarms. The researchers called it the sentinel hypothesis, and it suggests that our varied sleep patterns, which modern medicine often treats as disorders, might actually be an ancient survival feature. But the physical act of sleeping is only half the story. The schedule of sleeping mattered just as much. Here is something that would surprise almost anyone living in the 21st century. For most of human history, people did not sleep in one continuous block. They did not lie down at 10 at night and wake up at 6 in the morning. That pattern, the 8-hour consolidated sleep block, is a modern invention. And by modern, I mean it is roughly 200 years old. In 2005, a historian named Roger Ekirch at Virginia Tech published a book called At Day's Close that fundamentally reshaped how historians and sleep scientists understood pre-industrial rest. Ekirch had spent 16 years combing through diaries, court records, medical texts, prayer books, and personal letters from medieval and early modern Europe. What he found was reference after reference to something called first sleep and second sleep. People would go to bed shortly after dark, sleep for 3 to 4 hours, wake up for 1 to 2 hours in the middle of the night, and then go back to sleep until morning. This was not considered strange. It was not considered a sleep disorder. It was just how people slept. During that quiet waking period between first and second sleep, people did all sorts of things. They prayed, they talked, they reflected on dreams, which were often more vivid after first sleep because the brain had just completed its first deep sleep cycle. Some people got up and visited neighbors. Couples used this time for intimacy, which doctors at the time actually recommended as the ideal window for conception. A 16th century French physician named Laurent Joubert wrote explicitly that the best time for marital relations was after first sleep, when the body had rested but was not yet fully exhausted. Court records from the 1400s reference crimes committed during this window, which tells you it was common enough that significant numbers of people were reliably awake and active in the dead of night. Even literature reflected this rhythm. In Canterbury Tales, Chaucer references characters waking after first sleep. Don Quixote mentions it. Medical texts from the 1600s prescribed different remedies depending on whether a patient took them before first sleep or after second sleep. This was baked into the culture, the language, the daily rhythm of life. And then, slowly, it disappeared. Gaslighting in the 1800s extended the evening. Factory work in the Industrial Revolution imposed rigid schedules. By the early 1900s, consolidated sleep had become the new normal, and within a few generations, people forgot that segmented sleep had ever existed. When modern patients tell their doctors they wake up at 2 in the morning and cannot fall back asleep for an hour, they get diagnosed with middle-of-the-night insomnia. But Eckertsch's research suggests their bodies might simply be doing what human bodies did for thousands of years before Edison flipped a switch. And this pattern was not limited to Europe. Anthropological records from indigenous groups in South America, Southeast Asia, and Africa describe similar patterns of segmented sleep. The Tiv people of Nigeria, the Chaga of Tanzania, various Aboriginal Australian groups all had linguistic distinctions between first and second sleep. This was a global pattern. Consolidated 8-hour sleep was not the default. It was the exception imposed by industrialization, factory schedules, and artificial lighting. Which brings us to what might be the most counterintuitive finding of all. Modern hunter-gatherer groups do not sleep more than we do. They actually sleep less. In 2015, a team of researchers from UCLA published a study in the journal Current Biology that tracked the sleep habits of 94 adults across 3 pre-industrial societies: the Hadza in Tanzania, the San people of the Kalahari Desert in Namibia, and the Tsimane in the Bolivian Amazon. These groups have no electricity, no artificial lighting beyond fire, and no alarm clocks. They live in conditions closer to those of our ancient ancestors than any other humans on the planet. The average nightly sleep across all 3 groups was 6 hours and 25 minutes. Not 8, not 9, 6.5. Some individuals regularly slept 5.5 hours and showed no signs of sleep deprivation whatsoever. They woke without alarms. They reported feeling rested. And here is the part that stopped sleep researchers in their tracks. Chronic insomnia, the kind that affects tens of millions of people in the developed world, was virtually non-existent. The seaman language did not even have a word for it. When researchers tried to explain the concept of insomnia to seaman elders, they could not find a frame of reference. The idea that you would lie down and be unable to sleep was genuinely confusing to them. So, what was different? Was it the hard ground, the open air, the lack of screens? The researchers zeroed in on one variable that stood out above everything else: temperature. In all 3 groups, people did not fall asleep when the sun went down. That was the assumption going in, but it turned out to be wrong. Sunset happened, and people stayed awake for another 3 to 4 hours. They talked, they tended the fire, they told stories. What actually triggered sleep onset was the nightly temperature drop. People fell asleep as the air temperature was declining, and they woke up at the coldest point of the night, usually just before dawn. Sleep was synced to thermal cycles, not light cycles. This is a big deal because the modern bedroom is designed around the opposite principle. We keep our homes at a constant temperature. We use central heating and air conditioning to maintain 70 degrees Fahrenheit around the clock. And in doing so, we eliminate the very temperature signal that our bodies evolved to use as a sleep cue. Our ancestors fell asleep to falling temperatures and woke up to the cold of dawn. We fall asleep in climate-controlled boxes where the temperature never changes, and then we wonder why our brains do not know when to shut down. The researchers also noted something about light that challenged assumptions. Everyone expected that hunter-gatherers would go to sleep at sunset because they had no artificial light, but they did not. They had fire, and firelight is fundamentally different from electric light. Firelight is warm, amber-toned, and dim. It does not suppress melatonin the way blue-spectrum light from screens and LED bulbs does. The Hadza, the San, and the Tsimane all stayed up for hours after dark, gathered around fires, talking and socializing without disrupting their sleep onset. The fire gave them social time without the biological cost that a smartphone screen extracts. Our ancestors found the perfect balance between staying awake and preparing the body for sleep. And they did it with a technology that is 1,000,000 years old. The sleeping surfaces themselves also played a role that we are only beginning to understand. A growing body of research suggests that sleeping on firmer surfaces may activate different pressure points and promote different sleep postures than soft mattresses. In Japan, where futon sleeping on tatami mats remained common well into the 20th century, rates of chronic lower back pain were historically lower than in Western nations. Aboriginal Australians who sleep on the ground report different spinal alignment patterns than urban Australians who sleep on mattresses. None of this is conclusive, and the research is still in early stages. But it points to a possibility that would make the mattress industry very uncomfortable. The surface your ancestors slept on, a thin layer of grass over packed African earth, might have been better for your body than the 12-inch hybrid memory foam and pocket coil mattress you just financed over 36 months. The mattress industry is not incentivized to explore this question. Nobody makes money telling you that the floor works fine. Ancient Egyptians were among the first to build what we would recognize as raised beds, wooden frames with woven rope or reed surfaces elevated off the ground. These appeared around 3000 BCE, and they served a practical purpose. In the Nile River Delta, flooding, scorpions, and snakes made ground sleeping dangerous. Raising the sleeping surface was pest control, just like those camphor leaves in Sibudu Cave, but engineered with carpentry instead of botany. Egyptian beds were angled, with the head slightly elevated, and Egyptians used carved wooden or stone headrests instead of pillows. If you have ever seen one in a museum, your first thought was probably that it looks incredibly uncomfortable. But an Egyptian laborer who spent all day hauling limestone blocks had very different neck muscles than someone who spends all day looking at a laptop screen. The headrest worked because the body was adapted to it. The Romans took beds in a different direction. Wealthy Romans slept on mattresses stuffed with wool, feathers, or reeds, placed on wooden frames with leather straps or rope webbing. Poorer Romans slept on straw mats or directly on stone benches built into the walls of their homes. The divide between rich and poor sleep surfaces was one of the earliest examples of sleep as a class marker, a pattern that has only intensified over the centuries. Today, the difference between a $300 mattress and a $3,000 mattress is largely about marketing, but the social signal remains. How you sleep says something about who you are. That idea is at least 2,000 years old. In ancient China, the kang, a heated brick platform, served as both bed and living space. Families built fires beneath a raised stone or brick surface, and the retained heat radiated upward throughout the night. In northern China, where winter temperatures dropped well below freezing, the kang was the center of domestic life. You ate on it, worked on it, socialized on it, and slept on it. The whole family shared one platform. It was brilliantly efficient, and it maintained the ancient principle of thermal regulation as sleep aid. The kang is still used in rural parts of northern China today, which means some people are sleeping on a technology that is at least 2,000 years old. In medieval Europe, the common bed was a shared affair. Families slept together on straw-filled mattresses laid on wooden frames or directly on the floor. Travelers at inns routinely shared beds with strangers. This was not considered strange or inappropriate. It was just practical. Beds were expensive, heat was expensive, bodies were warm and free. The privacy obsession that would eventually give every family member their own bed, their own room, and their own carefully selected mattress was still centuries away. But even as sleeping surfaces became more elaborate across civilizations, the basic experience of sleep remained much closer to what our cave-dwelling ancestors knew than to what we experience today. Rooms were dark because there were no electric lights. Nights were quiet because there were no cars, no planes, no buzzing refrigerators. Temperatures dropped naturally because there was no central heating. And, most importantly, people slept in shared spaces. The private bedroom is an invention of the 1700s among European elites. For the overwhelming majority of human history, you slept near other people. You heard their breathing. You felt their warmth. You were never alone in the dark. That last point might matter more than any mattress technology ever could. Loneliness and social isolation are now recognized as major risk factors for insomnia. People who live alone are significantly more likely to report sleep problems than people who share a bed or a room with someone else. The sound of another person breathing, the subtle warmth of a nearby body, the unconscious awareness that someone else is present. These are neurological safety signals that our brains have been interpreting for hundreds of thousands of years. When those signals are absent, the brain stays on low-level alert. It scans for threats that are not there. It keeps one ear open. It does exactly what it was designed to do in a world where sleeping alone meant you were vulnerable and possibly abandoned. Our ancestors never faced this particular challenge. They slept in groups because survival demanded it, but in doing so, they also created the conditions for deep, restful sleep in a way that a $1,400 cooling mattress cannot replicate. So, where does this leave us? We are a species that evolved to sleep on the ground, near fire, in groups, synchronized to the falling temperature of the night sky. We slept in 2 shifts with a quiet waking period in between. We did not need alarm clocks because our bodies responded to thermal cues and the light of dawn creeping across an open savanna. We did not need melatonin supplements because our circadian rhythms were calibrated by the sun, not by the blue glow of a phone screen at midnight. We did not need white noise machines because the ambient sound of a sleeping camp, the crackle of a fire, the breathing of nearby family members, the rustle of wind through grass was the white noise machine. Somewhere along the way, we traded all of that for a temperature-controlled box, a memory foam rectangle, and a glowing screen we stare at until our eyes burn. We replaced the campfire with the television. We replaced the sleeping group with solitary bedrooms. We replaced the falling night air with forced air heating. And then we called it progress. None of this means you should throw out your mattress and go sleep in the yard. Modern life has genuinely different demands. You probably cannot show up to work covered in dirt and explain that you were syncing your circadian rhythm to thermal gradients. But the research does suggest that some very simple, very old ideas still work. Letting your room get cooler at night instead of maintaining a constant temperature. Dimming lights in the evening instead of flooding your house with brightness until the moment you close your eyes. Not panicking when you wake up at 2 in the morning because your brain might just be running a program it has been running for hundreds of thousands of years. And maybe, just maybe, reconsidering whether you actually need a $2,000 mattress or whether your ancient ancestor sleeping on packed earth and river grass inside a South African cave had already figured out what your body really needs. For 300,000 years, humans slept without beds. They slept on the ground, near fires, surrounded by the people they trusted, in rhythm with the cooling air and the turning of the planet. They did not have a word for insomnia because they did not need one. The real question is not how they managed to sleep without modern technology. The real question is why we cannot seem to sleep with it. If this changed how you think about sleep, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us what surprised you the most. And if you know someone who spends too much money on mattresses, do them a favor and share this video.